So continuing our series looking at Gideon, I'll read Judges chapter 8 from verse 1 through to 27. Now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, "Why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian?" And they challenged him vigorously. But he answered them, "What have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer? God gave Oreb and Zeb, the Midianite leaders, into your hands. What was I able to do compared to you?" At this their resentment against him subsided. Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted yet keeping up the pursuit, came to the Jordan and crossed it. He said to the men of Succoth, "Give my troops some bread. They're worn out, and I am still pursuing Zebah and Salmunna, the kings of Midian." But the officials of Succoth said, "Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Salmunna in your possession? Why should we give your bread to your troops?" And Gideon replied, "Just for that, when the Lord has given Zebah and Salmunna into my hand, I will tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars." From there he went up to Peniel and made the same request of them, but they answered as the men of Succoth had. So he said to the men of Peniel, "When I return in triumph, I will tear down this tower." Now Zebah and Salmunna were in Karkor, with a force of about 15,000 men, all that were left of the armies of the eastern peoples. 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. Gideon went up by the route of the nomads east of Nobah, Jogbehar, and attacked the unsuspecting army. Zebah and Salmunna, the two kings of Midian, fled, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. Gideon, son of Joash, then returned from battle by the pass of Heres. He caught a young man of Succoth and questioned him, and the young man wrote down for him the names of the 77 officials of Succoth, the elders of the town. Then Gideon came and said to the men of Succoth, "Here are Zebah and Salmunna, about whom you taunted me by saying, 'Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Salmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your exhausted men?'" He took the elders of the town and taught the men of Succoth a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. He also pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the town. Then he asked Zebah and Salmunna, "What kind of men did you kill at Tabor?" "Men like you," they answered, "each one with the bearing of a prince." Gideon replied, "Those were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not kill you." Turning to Jether, his eldest son, he said, "Kill them." But Jether did not draw his sword because he was only a boy and was afraid. Zebah and Salmunna said, "Come, do it yourself. As is the man, so is his strength." So Gideon stepped forward and killed them and took the ornaments off their camels' necks. The Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And he said, "I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." It was a custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. They answered, "We'll be glad to give them." So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw a ring from his plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshipping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. So a little reminder of what we've already covered as we thought about the life of Gideon. We suggested that the church in this country is is so frightened of what people might think and say that we're effectively hiding in a hole. We've asked how a Christian can have the assurance of their relationship with God. And how can we know what God is calling us to? How can we test what we believe God has said? And last week we looked at the great truth that actually God deliberately calls the weak and the apparently ill-equipped so that he gets the glory. So what happens now? How might we respond when we know that we're called? Or perhaps how do we respond if God doesn't call us into a role that we think we ought to have? And Gideon gives us examples of all these things in chapter 8. And first of all, a response to perhaps being overlooked. If you remember when Gideon sounded the trumpet and called God's people to battle, we said that he summoned his own tribe, Manasseh, and the other northern tribes of Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. If you look at this map, you might see that he missed Issachar as one of the northern tribes. He also didn't call anybody further south than Manasseh. He didn't call Ephraim or Dan. And no reason is given as to why he didn't, and we don't know whether it was an oversight or a deliberate decision. But for whatever reason, these people of God's kingdom weren't summoned to the battle to save God's people from the eastern invaders. But in chapter 7, verse 24, when the invaders fled south from the 300 soldiers with Gideon, it was the people of Ephraim who were called upon to stop them escaping. And they captured two of the kings who had joined forces. They captured Oreb and Zeb. And then they suddenly realised, hang on a minute, you went to war without us. You called God's people together, but you didn't call all of God's people. Why did you ignore us? Why did you overlook us? And in chapter 8, they come to Gideon and they challenge him strongly about this. Why didn't you call us? Why did you overlook us and not allow us to be part of doing this? Gideon uses all the powers of diplomacy that he has and says that by capturing the two great kings, they've achieved far more than he had done. Their honour was greater in what they had achieved. We get a real lesson about feeling overlooked. Because this can happen all too often in churches. Why wasn't I invited onto the leadership team, or invited to be an elder or a deacon or a trustee, or invited onto the youth team, whatever it might be? Why didn't the church ask me to do that job? Or why was I asked to step back from a job that I was doing when I felt that I was doing it well? And I think we can understand why people feel like that. We understand why that can hurt and why that can niggle away at us. Ever since we were at school and we weren't picked for the sports team or whatever it might have been that we weren't picked for, those horrible moments when you all lined up against the fence and two captains pick players and you're always the last one. And we kind of know what that disappointment and that resentment can feel like when we're overlooked for another person. Somebody who I work with on the ambulance, who's now in their 40s, every Christmas they ask me and say, are you having a nativity play this year? And if so, please can I play Mary? That they're still bitter at not being cast as Mary when they were 8. And we understand. I'll say, look, Fred, you'd look silly in a blue dress anyway, mate. We kind of understand that feeling, because that's how we felt as children when we were overlooked. But now we're children of God, no longer infants. And we have God's word, which reminds us that we shouldn't consider our own good so much as the good of others. We should do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. In humility, we should value others above ourselves. This passage gives us another reason why we shouldn't begrudge somebody else being chosen instead of us. Because God always knows what is best. And very often he has another plan for us, a better role for us. No, the Ephraimites had not been called to join the battle. But they were on hand to chase down the invading army when they fled. And they wouldn't have been there. They wouldn't have been in that area where the invaders had run off to if they'd joined Gideon in the battle. As a result, they captured two of the leading figures. And they're recorded in the Bible as being the people who did that. Their names are there in the Bible. It was the Ephraimites who captured these two people. And Gideon used humility and wisdom to deal with this potential argument when the Ephraimites complained. He pointed out what a great job they did when they were called upon. And for us, not being called for one particular way of serving within the church may well free us up to spend more time perhaps learning or preparing for the next job that God would lead us to. Maybe it will free us up for visiting others or for giving hours and hours every day in prayer. We're in a really unique position as a church in that very few of us are in full-time education or employment. That means our prayer capacity as a church is far higher than most others. Maybe God is calling some of us here to be real intercessors, being willing to give up hours every day just praying for the work of this church, praying for the others within the church, praying for God's church around the world. That could be at home on your own. It could be partnering with somebody else and meeting up and joining. There's something really encouraging about meeting with somebody and just praying and praying and praying. We shouldn't be distressed when somebody else is asked to undertake a role that we would have liked to do or think that we could have done. Rather, we should look instead at what God might be calling us to elsewhere in his service. Then as this chapter goes on, we start to see a very different Gideon to the one that we've come to know in recent weeks. Because when Gideon feels rejected, he acts with anger at those people who've refused to help him, threatening to tear people's flesh with thorn branches and pull down towers. There's a very telling difference in the records of the two battles that Gideon fights. In the first battle that's recorded in chapter 7, God is at the very centre of that narrative. It's God who guides Gideon and says, no, send away most of your forces. It's God who sends Gideon down to hear what's going on in the camp. It is God who turns that camp into absolute turmoil and the people start attacking one another so that Gideon and his soldiers don't need to raise a sword to win the battle. The second of his recorded battles, in verses 10 to 12 of the chapter that we've just read, God is not mentioned once. Suddenly it's all about Gideon. And having won this battle, thinking that he won it, it was me, it was all about me, he returns from the battle still full of anger and frustration. making good his promise to whip people with thorns and pull down towers. Then in verses 18 to 21, he passes summary judgment on these two kings and tells his young son, still a boy, it says, to kill them. The boy refuses and he carries out the execution himself. Why does he kill them? It's just sheer revenge. They taunt him twice. First about the people that they'd killed. And then in verse 21, they question his masculinity. And he just can't stand that. And his own pride and his own anger well up inside him, and he kills these two men out of revenge and pride. God gave Gideon a task. His task was to defeat the gathered armies of the eastern people and protect God's people. And God gave that victory to Gideon. God used him to achieve that in the first battle. But Gideon took it upon himself to do so much more. And he acted out of vengeance and anger and machismo, which is not a good look for the person who God has just used. I know that we all probably have slightly different views, but I kind of see some similarities with the way that Israel is responding to Hamas and Hezbollah in Gaza and Palestine. That there's a vengeance and a machismo that seems to be driving so much of what they're doing and targeting people who simply were not involved. And I do not believe that is God's will for them to be doing that. But rather than looking at what other people are doing, how other people are responding, we always need to look at these lessons and look at ourselves. And in our own lives, when we have been overlooked for a position or we've been treated badly or ignored, and there's part of us that wants revenge, isn't there? There's that little bit of us that's working away inside, and we want to hit back. Whether it's through a harsh word or a sarcastic comment in a moment. Perhaps by furthering rumours about somebody. Or maybe overlooking them in future to get them back. Somehow we harbour that vengeance and we look for a way in the future. God's command to Gideon was to protect his people. But instead, he sought vengeance. Our command is to love and support our brothers and sisters, to help share the gospel of Jesus Christ with a needy world, to love our enemies as Jesus taught. Indeed, as we look at the way that Gideon acted following this battle, we see real clear contrasts between Gideon and our Lord Jesus Christ. In verse 22, the people encourage Gideon to effectively become the first human king of Israel. And his words are humble and they sound godly. No, he says, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. And that is how the nation of Israel was meant to be. It wasn't meant to have a king like the nations around them. It was meant to be ruled by God. God was going to speak through the prophets and speak through the priests, and the nation would live to serve God and to give him glory. And yes, his words sound humble and they sound correct, but his actions go on to belie the apparent humility of his words. He took the ornaments from the necks of the camels of the eastern kings, and he took their kingly robes from them, signs that they're king. Effectively, he was taking crowns for himself, symbols of authority and leadership for himself. Then he asked for people for something that sounded humble enough, just one ring from each of the soldiers, a small piece of the plunder that they'd taken from the Ishmaelites. But it's what he did with it that was the problem. made himself an ephod. When God gave Moses rules for the people of Israel and how they were to worship in the tabernacle and later in the temple, he told Moses to have an ephod made. It was this highly ornate waistcoat that was to be worn by the high priest. And there should be just one, only one ephod. It was to be used by the high priest only to discern God's will and his judgment on matters that were brought to the tabernacle. Gideon had no right to make one. He certainly had no right to wear one. He wasn't the high priest. He wasn't even from the priestly clan. He wasn't a Levite. But he made himself out to be the one through whom God would speak to the Israelites. All pretense of humility is shattered as we see what he really wants people to think about him. And as it says in verse 27, the people worshipped at the ephod and it became a snare to them. Gideon's humility was superficial. He was acting well above the position that God had given him. And as we finish, just compare the human, the man Gideon, with Jesus Christ. Because like Gideon, Jesus also spoke humbly. He said, whoever wants to be great among you must become your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man himself, who he was talking about, did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. He said to his followers, serve with humility. And he added, because that's what I'm going to do. I came to serve. And I'll show you how much I'm going to serve. I will give my life for you. When the disciples met for the Last Supper, there was no servant on hand to wash the feet of the guests. The disciples looked around embarrassed. Who'd overlooked this part of the arrangement? Here was a job that needed doing, but surely none of them would lower themselves to such a degree as to wash somebody's feet. Jesus showed the very humility that he'd spoken of. He left them absolutely aghast as he wrapped a towel around himself and washed the feet of each one of his disciples. Would he really give his life as a ransom for many? Was this just hyperbole, words used as a synonym for something else? The only perfect person to ever walk this planet allowed himself to be treated as the worst criminal and offered his body to crucifixion. Why? To fulfill the role of the servant king who died for the souls of every man, woman and child who would gladly submit themselves to his authority and confess their sin and ask for forgiveness and then live with him as their eternal Lord. And he says to us, will you follow my example of humility? Jesus was overlooked and ignored and disdained. And part of the way that we live out the similar humility to Jesus Christ is the way in which we deal with rejection or being overlooked. We can react with anger and vengeance and pride, which will soon become a snare which leads us away from God's desires. Or we can choose to accept that God maybe has a better plan. And we wish the person well who got the job instead. But undertake to see what God would have us do. Let's choose to live the righteous humility that God has given to us as a gift when we turn to Him for salvation.